Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the London Borough of Hackney Audit Committee. Today is the 31st of January. To my right, I have Mark Agnew from Governance Services, who's supporting me. I am going to welcome also our external visitors as well, and also our officers as well, and also welcome anybody online who is watching, and also those that are in attendance. I can't see anybody from the public. So first things first, apologies for lateness have been received from Councillor Cratworth, and Councillor Gordon and Councillor Maxwell are joining remotely. Mark, do we have any other
Apologies, no.
Apologies, no. Okay. So just before I start the meeting, I just wanted to remind members of the purpose of the Audit Committee, and I always think it's worthwhile also just to revisit this at every meeting, is that we're responsible for assisting the Council in discharging its functions in relation to the Council's risk management framework, the internal financial and governance control environment, and integrity of the financial reporting and annual governance processes. We're there to provide an independent assurance. The committee is there to provide an independent assurance to us as councillors on the adequacy of the risk management framework and the internal control environment. So it's an independent review of Hackney's governance, risk management and control frameworks. It oversees the financial reporting and annual governance. And it also oversees internal and external audit, which we'll hear about as well this evening, helping to ensure efficient and effective assurance arrangements. So it's, as councillors, we sit here in an independent capacity, not quite literally, but that's our role. So declarations of interest, agenda item 2. Is there any declarations of interest that have been received before the meeting, or anybody would like to declare any now? So just moving on to agenda item 3, which is minutes of the previous meeting. Hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to read these, and I will take any queries about the minutes if people feel there is any. Okay, so for the agenda this evening, we have made a quick change to support our external auditors to make sure that they're able to provide an update on what's happening. So before I hand over again, it's the recommendations in the report. We're going to be recommended to note the contents of the reports and then authorise the Group Director of Finance to approve the final statement of accounts for 22-23, contingent upon the completion of the outstanding work by the external auditor as detailed in the audit completion reports, which are in your papers. So I'd like to hand over, and if you could just introduce yourselves, that would be great. And thank you very much for actually being in the building. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. We are presenting to you this evening our audit completion reports for the councils and the pension fund accounts for the year ending March 2023. I'm going to ask Stuart and Tom to just take you through some of the key messages of those two reports. But before I do that, I just wanted to clarify the position on 21-22. That's your March 22 year end. I was hoping to have signed that by now, and I'm literally inches away from signing. Suffice to say, certain things have just taken a bit longer than we all expected to get assurances over. We've had some last minute queries through our final quality review process, but we are essentially in a position to sign 21-22 very shortly, and that will be an unqualified opinion on both council and pension fund. And just before I hand over to Stuart to take you through the council reports, both the council and the pension fund for 22-23, we are also proposing unqualified audit opinion. So sort of a clean bill of health on both sets of accounts. But let me hand over to Stuart.
Thank you. I assume the report as being read. I'll take the committee through a few key points from that. Starting with the status of the audit, which is section 2 in our report. The principal point to note of this is that the first item on the list has now been completed, so our work on PPE is finalised. The rest of the work will be finalised as we complete the audit. So at this stage, we would expect them still to be outstanding. As Suresh says, though, we are intending to issue at this stage, we're proposing an unqualified opinion. Moving through to section 4, where we deal with the significant findings and significant matters identified on the audit. I'll take you through very quickly on those in terms of where we are and link that through to other sections of the report. We deal with the 4 significant risks we identified as our audit strategy memorandum, which we took to this committee in, I think, October of last year. Dealing with those in respect of management override controls, i.e. management's ability to amend and influence the figures in the accounts. We've completed our work, we've reviewed a significant number of transactions and have identified no issues from that we need to bring to committee's attention. In respect of the valuation of land and buildings and also the valuation of your investment properties, again, we've done a detailed review of a number of valuations in year. We've identified some specific points from those valuations in terms of an unadjusted error, specifically on your infrastructure assets, but this is purely an accounting error in terms of depreciation values being removed from statements. And that is detailed in section 6. Other than that, we have no other issues to bring to the attention of the committee at this point. As I mentioned, the work is finished on both PPE and investment properties. In terms of the valuation of your local government pension scheme amount in the accounts, we've completed our work on that as well, and we've got no issues to bring to the attention of committee at this point either. We have, and this does interrelate to Tom's report on the pension fund, which I'll let him deal with in detail. Over the course of the year, there are some significant matters we've discussed with members. Infrastructure, which is a result of a national change to accounting and how the council deals with that. On that issue, we have identified one area for improvement, which we've detailed in section 5, our internal control recommendations around your useful lives for some of the infrastructure assets and making a recommendation for changing those. This is just a follow-up, and as the area is developed, this is something that came into existence in terms of disclosures as part of the 21-2 accounts, and it's developed over the course of the year, and hence we've made a recommendation in section 5 to improve your useful life and analysis thereof. We also discussed the reinforced aerated autoclave concrete or RAC issue that has arisen. We know it's well dealt with within schools nationally, but obviously we've considered your response to that across your remaining portfolio, and we're happy with the approach and status of the updates that the council has got on those, that there's not a material issue to identify to be addressed within the financial statements. Moving into section 5, we have this year made 4 internal control recommendations. These are all at level 2 or level 3, which are medium and are about strengthening your controls internally rather than a significant issue. Infrastructure assets, as I've mentioned. We've also discussed investment property valuations, where we identified small weakness around the rentals being used in the valuations and whether they've been updated. Again, it's a level 2, so it needs to be improved, but not resulting in a material issue. We've also identified some concerns around related parties and the documentation of those within your systems, and as well as a minor point on income cutoff, which again, as a result of a small error in one of our test samples, gives us an unadjusted misstatement in section 6. In section 6, I will only draw attention to one specific point, which is the specific materiality on payables and around member allowances. I should point out at this point, it's a very niche point. It's done to a lower value because of the interest in members' allowances, but it arises because of a timing difference between when things are accounted for and when you sign off on allowances. It is not significant, but we're doing it because we report to a low level. At this point, unless there are questions on this, although I think it may be easier to take them at the end, I'll hand to Tom so he can deal with the pension fund report.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart. So I'll do a similar thing to how Stuart's just done here. So if you turn to page 163, which is the status of the audit, all of the sections are now in green, so those are which we don't think will have a material adjustment to the audit. So now we're just down to our final review procedures, our closure procedures, and the review of the annual report. The final section on the financial instruments classification, the work has now been concluded, manager reviewed, and we're just waiting on Suresh to give us the green light before we can tick that one off. So we're not expecting any adjustments as a result of that. Moving on to page 169, this is the section on significant findings. So first of all, we've looked at the management override of controls as we've done at the main council. We've assessed the risk of override by looking at the accounting estimates, by considering the identified significant transactions outside of the normal course of business, and also by looking at journals recorded in the general ledger and other adjustments made in the preparation of financial statements. And we haven't got anything to report to you. 1 second, I have the page. The next level was the valuation of the level 3 investments. So we addressed the risk by looking at the holdings which fund manager reports to the global custodians reports. We agreed the valuation to supporting documentation, including investment manager valuation statements and cash flows. We reviewed and assessed the independence of the information used in assessing the fair values, and we agreed the investment manager valuation to the audited accounts and to other independent supporting documentation where available. Our audit testing didn't find any issues that we need to report to the committee. Moving on to section 5, the internal control recommendations. There is just one recommendation on the pension fund side. This is in relation to the service auditor reports which the council, the pension fund get from service auditors of the fund managers. So these reports look at the control environments of the funds themselves, and usually they'll run up until the year end, but some of the reports didn't in this case. Usually where they don't run coterminously with the financial year end, a bridging letter will provide assurance over the design and operation of controls at the fund managers. But we noted that some of the letters don't cover the full period to the balance sheet date, and some had a gap of 3 or more months. As a result, we noted that management don't have in place formal procedures to obtain assurance over the control environment at the fund managers for the full intervening period. As I say, this is a level 3, so we don't expect that there would be any material issues arising, but we are recommending that the pension fund should make sure it's got mechanisms in place to obtain appropriate assurances from fund managers regarding the control environment, and to review service auditor reports and bridging letters for each fund manager to consider the impact of any reported deficiencies on the pension fund's control environment. As I say, there aren't any misstatements for us to report, so I'll hand back there for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I can see Councillor Smythe's got his hand up. Anyone else? And Councillor Garbutt. Councillor Smythe, away you go.
Yeah, thank you for these reports. I mean, your function is absolutely critical to the council's well-being, in fact, overall. But just on the significant findings in section 4, I believe, around the management override of controls. I'm just interested because of the way that it's been put. You say there was a risk, a material risk. You mentioned how you addressed that risk, and then you go on to say that the conclusion was essentially you haven't identified any evidence of mismanagement, override of controls, and any material misstatement due to fraud. Did that come before there was a risk or after you thought there was a risk? Or did your controls come in and sort the risk out? Do you see what I mean? I'm just trying to understand this kind of logic of those statements. Thank you.
That's a good question. So management override of controls is essentially a mandated risk for pretty much any audit, because obviously management is in that position that it could override controls. So the risk is pretty much always there. We then design those procedures that we've explained to see if there is any evidence of that override materially. We can't look at everything, obviously, so we apply materiality. And then based on the work that we've done, where we haven't found any evidence, that then supports the conclusion that we've drawn. So there is a flow to the risk, procedures, conclusion.
Chair, there seems to be a presumption there to start with on this, yeah, but there's a presumption that it may happen, yeah, that is a risk. Cool, thank you.
Councillor Garbett.
Yeah, thank you for this. Really thorough and really important stuff. I was just going to ask about the section 5 around the infrastructure record keeping, and just a bit more detail about what hadn't happened, and so just to provide assurance that that's the only area. It just seems a bit specific, and if that's the only area that error had been found. Yeah, just a bit more information about that, really. Thank you.
So it's a little bit of a tricky one to explain. Basically, what has happened is that there's been an issue which has arisen across the country, and all audit firms and councils have had to deal with. So what has happened has been that traditionally councils have been spending a certain amount on infrastructure every year and then depreciating off the balances as time goes on the assumption that the amount spent will replace components which are replaced in time. But the problem with that is that as it's gone on, the cost of the assets which are recorded on the balance sheet have continued to increase, and at the same time so has the depreciation. And what hasn't happened is that they haven't been written off the books. So the net position has remained correct, but the actual the costs and the accumulated depreciation have been overstated. As I say, this is across the country. So what has happened is that the regulators and the code, there's a statutory override at the moment that government have put in place, which enables us to, in effect, ignore that issue while councils figure out where the assets themselves are. Because as you can imagine, if you're not recording specific assets, but just a wider spend, then you can't decide which bits specifically will net off to take that balance out. So as a result of the work that's been undertaken on this area, what we've found is that the useful lives which the council are using at the moment don't line up to the newly related guidance. Now, it's not a material issue, and there are reasons behind it. So there's a guideline for the life of bridges, which is, I think, 100 years. And the life the council are using is 25 years for the majority of them. This is because a lot of the bridges are much older than 100 years, and the life relates to components which have been replaced. So they might have a life of 25 years. However, because there aren't granular records which have been kept, it means that the council can't substantiate that, and so we can't prove it. So this is going to be an ongoing issue which is across councils for a long time to come. So that's where this problem has come from. Has that answered?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So to check my understanding, it's bridges now, but it could be other stuff as we go along.
There could be, but all of the other lives that the council have are in line with expectations. So it was only bridges where the material issue arose. So we don't expect, having looked at the register, that any other issues would crop up.
Okay, thanks so much. So can I just clarify that we're going to note the contents of the reports and authorise the Group Director of Finance to approve the final statement of accounts for 2022-23, continuing on the completion of the outstanding work, but we've gone through that as detailed in the audit completion. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you very much. The next item is agenda item 4, which is, are you still? Yeah, I'm sorry. Finance up. Are you wanting to leave? You'll stay for this bit as well, aren't you? Yeah, sorry, I could sort of see half people moving in that. Apologies for those watching online. It's a bit like musical chairs. Okay, so agenda item 4, can I invite, which is a finance update. We're going to combine it with agenda item 5, which is the Treasury Management update and the Treasury Management strategy. And can I invite Jackie Moylan, our interim group director, and her team to present this?
Hope that's coming up on screen now for everybody. Let me just put it on slideshow so it's clearer. Brilliant, thank you. So the presentation today, as a chair set out, we're also covering item 5, which is a Treasury Management update, and item 6, which is approval of the Treasury Management strategy to go forward to Cabinet and full Council at the end of the month, end of February, I should say. We'll also be covering the General Fund 23-24 forecast, HRA, a little brief economic context, a run through the provisional local government finance settlement, which the Council received before Christmas, a very brief overview in terms of the medium-term financial plan, an overview of the capital programme and Treasury Management, as I mentioned, the Treasury Management strategy, which is put forward for the committee to approve to go forward to full Council, a very brief update on the accounts, which you've already seen most of actually, and then finally a summary of where we are in relation to deep dives. So the forecast position on the General Fund, as was reported to Cabinet last week, is a forecast overspend of 11.4 million. That is mainly driven by overspends in relation to adult health and integration, which is care support commissioning, mental health and provided services primarily. And similarly, in children's education, we're seeing an overspend driven by primarily looked after children placements and costs in leaving care. And in F&R, finance and resources, that primarily relates to housing benefits and revenues and ICT. In that area, a lot of it is, I'm afraid, is still some element of the cyber attack where we're working hard to bring revenues in. So where we've had backlogs in relation to chasing council tax and NDR, we've got additional resources in there to recover that position. And there's also a slight overspend, or not a slight, just under £1 million overspend in climate, homes and economy, and that's primarily in relation to environmental operations. In terms of the remaining overspend of the 11.4 million, what we're currently doing is reviewing some underspent budgets corporately, some of the corporate contingencies we hold, reviewing our provisions in some areas, and also looking at reserves to cover the overspend at year end. And there'll be further detail on how we're going to do that in next month's OFP. In terms of the OFP that went to Cabinet in January, we also note there the significant work that's been done to support our residents in relation to the cost of living crisis, and I haven't repeated that in the slides here. And we also note that the pay award for 23-24 was more than budgeted, as it was for a lot of councils actually. And while we're meeting that from one-off resource this year, for 24-25, that is built into the budget planning process and is fully covered on an ongoing basis. In terms of the HRA, we're forecasting a balanced position after drawing down £1 million from reserves, and that was a planned drawdown, and is in relation to, I'm sure Deirdre, correct me if I'm wrong, is in relation to heat charges and utilities charges, where we was smoothing in increases for service charges in relation to heat and light, etc. On income, there's some significant variances around non-dwelling rent, income from tenant charges and other charges for services and facilities. And on expenditure, we've got some pressures in reactive repairs and special services. Is there any questions in relation to the forecast before I move on? not at the moment. Okay. So I'll carry on. So a little bit of economic context. As members will probably know, CPI rose by 4% in the 12 months December 2023, which is up slightly from November. In terms of the bank rate, that remains steady, and we're expecting some decreases in that towards the latter part of this year. PWLB rates are still elevated, meaning a higher cost of borrowing. Obviously, that impacts on our capital programme, but not immediately, as we haven't undertaken any additional borrowing since we last met as an audit committee. In terms of the unemployment rate, that was largely unchanged in the last quarter at 4.2%, and we've seen in terms of the public sector net borrowing in December, that was 7.8 billion, around half or 8.4 billion less than was borrowed in the previous year. So moving on to the local government provisional settlement, which we received on the 18th of December. So obviously the timing of that presents us quite a lot of issues in terms of balancing the budget for 24/5 and making provision for future years. So in terms of the main points to note from that provisional settlement, the core spending power increases by 6.5% in cash terms across England. It's worth mentioning there that core spending power assumes that all the councils take out the maximum in terms of what they can do in relation to council tax. So for 24/5, that is 4.99% for Hackney. In terms of business rates, there was changes in relation to business rates where the multiplier, which is how much the council is allowed to increase business rates bills, was frozen in previous years. In this year, for 24/25, it's not frozen for businesses with rateable value over £51,000. In effect, that doesn't really affect us that much actually, because where there's a business rates are frozen, we get compensated for that by way of grant. Social care grant was announced as increasing by £692 million across nationally, but it's worth mentioning here that was what was announced in previous years, so that wasn't a surprise. But we'll come on to the announcement of last week in relation to some additionality. The Market Sustainability Improvement Fund will be 1.1 billion in 2024, which was as expected, and similarly in relation to the Improve Better Care Fund. Where we did see some really dramatic shifts was in funding in relation to the services grant, which nationally reduced from 406 million to 77 million, so a massive increase, a decrease of around 84%. That decrease, we did anticipate some decrease in Hackney, but not as significant as that. But in terms of our sort of budget planning, that was offset by the fact that the inflationary factor used for some of our other funding stream was higher than was anticipated. Because inflation remained higher than anticipated for last year. We also saw some announcements around the homelessness prevention grant allocations increasing by 150 million nationally, although the precise allocations to individual boroughs hasn't been announced yet. And it's worth mentioning that 150 million increase nationally doesn't even cover the London-wide issue in relation to the increasing cost of homelessness. It's worth mentioning as well that as part of the consultation exercise that the government was collecting data in relation to the 4-day week and the potential of using financial levers in future settlements to disincentivise the practice of implementing a 4-day week. You would have seen a lot of press coverage around the government's response to that, which has been piloted in some boroughs. In terms of since the settlement, last week on the 24th of January, the government announced that it would increase local authority funding over and above what was announced before Christmas. There'd be additional £600 million. Of that 600 million, around 500 million was to go into the social care grant. We estimate for Hackney that would be around additional £3 million for 24/25, but that will be go into social care budgets, and obviously our pressures in those areas is significant. So although it's really welcome to have additional funding, it clearly won't be enough for next year. Moving on, I think a really important thing to note from the provisional settlement, it was a lack of information in relation to future years. So sort of this time last year, we had a fairly good idea around what our funding level would be for 24/25, because there have been markers laid down in relation to some of the larger funding streams, such as social care grant. We haven't got any of that information for 25/6. So when we're developing our medium-term financial plan, as we are at the moment, that there will be a fair amount of estimation in there in relation to our external funding. And it's worth emphasising here for us, that's quite significant, because in some boroughs, they've got a much higher council tax base than we have, which gives them quite a lot of certainty over their income levels. Because we rely on a lot of external government funding, then our certainty is a lot less, and we have to obviously plan on that basis and have certainly be prudent in terms of what we expect our external income to be. In terms of what was announced in the autumn statement, they did announce a growth at 1% in real terms from 25.6 to 28.9, but that was over all departmental spending limits, and sort of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, they estimate that, bearing in mind the commitments the government's made around things like the NHS, schools, etc., what that will mean for local government is in real terms cut over that period. Moving on to the MTFP position. Now, this is very brief because we're currently refreshing the MTFP as part of the budget setting process of 24-25. But members will recall that we identified a gap of 22 million for 24-5 and 57 million over the 3-year period. And some of the members will be involved in a lot of the scrutiny around the budget proposals. Budget proposals have been developed throughout the year, been taken through the scrutiny process, and a number of those proposals have already been agreed at Cabinet. So at the moment, we're in the final throes of finalising the budget to take to Cabinet and full council at the end of the month. And as I said previously, we'll be updating the medium-term financial plan to include 27-28. So this will probably be one of the last times you'll see those 3 figures, because we're updating that from now on. In terms of the council's capital programme, so in terms of the second OFP capital programme monitoring report went on in terms of the financial year 23-24 was presented to Cabinet in November, and this forecast was 210 million spend for the current financial year, which was 40 million below the revised budget. The main reasons for the variances has been set out before, actually, around economic factors. So construction industry inflation resulted in tender prices being above cost estimates, and further work required on the viability of some schemes, which has caused an overall delay to scheme progression. There's also a number of other factors, external and internal, which is reflected in the reprofiling. And just to point out some of the areas where the main variances have arisen from. So in terms of economic factors, we've seen in the estate regeneration programme and housing supply programme, a total of 62 million reprofiled, and the most significant variance relates to Coval for Phase 2C, which is currently in a pre-construction services agreement. So we expect that to move forward and that spend to start occurring, but there has been some delay. There's another couple of examples of schemes that are now on site and under contract, where we should be seeing spend coming through and those schemes being delivered. Other factors include the Britannia project, where we've seen a £36 million reprofiled, and that is where we've reprofiled our cash flows in line with in line with our now procured contractors' cash flow. And there's also been some delays in relation to leisure parks and green spaces, and finally in regen and economic development sites. Moving on to Treasury management, as set out in the Treasury management update, we've undertaken no new long-term borrowing. However, the cost of borrowing has remained elevated. The higher interest rates has also meant there's been an uptick in terms of our investment income. So that's basically a one-off gain, which is not sustainable given we're going to move into an increased borrowing position, but nonetheless, it does help with the current year's forecast. As we mentioned previously, the bank rate has been held down at 5.25% in December 2023, and our Treasury advisors think that this is the peak of the bank rate, and they're forecasting rate cuts from Q3 2024. So moving on to the Treasury management strategy, as we always do at this time of the year, we bring forward the draft Treasury management strategy, which will go forward for approval to full council at the end of the month, subject to the capital programme that is being finalised ahead of the budget report. So in terms of the key point of the Treasury management strategy, it sets out how the council's cash flow will be managed during the financial year 24-25. It also sets out the cost of borrowing interest on investments will depend on market conditions and timing. which is obviously really important in relation to when we take up borrowing or don't take up borrowing. The potential indications which are set out are still being finalised and subject to the final budget setting, particularly around capital, and will be included in the full council report. There's also a couple of new sources for long-term and short-term borrowing which have been included in the Treasury Management Strategy, and there's a link here to sort of green finance in particular. So we've included in there the ability to be able to launch our community and municipal investment green loan issuance, which is going to Cabinet in February. Yes. So that is not a massive source of income, I might say, but it's a really good scheme to allow sort of local communities to invest in the green projects of Hackney. And I'm sure if anyone's got any questions on that, Deirdre will be able to give us a little bit more of an update. In terms of the accounts, I think we've covered this. So I won't go into this in too much detail. It'll be great when we get our 21-22 opinion in the next few days, hopefully. And then hopefully following soon after will be the 22-23 opinion. And we've got still a little bit more to get that across the line, but hopefully that will be certainly should be signed off by the time we meet again. So Audit Committee deep dives. So there's 3 Audit Committee deep dives for this year. The Public Interest Report one, we've actually done the deep dive. The report was due to come this evening to Audit Committee, but there was sort of a conflict in terms of the audit are also doing a review, a deep dive. So we wanted to make sure that we'd taken on board what was coming out of that audit, but that hopefully a lot of the members here came along to that session. It was very, very helpful, but we want to make sure those two align. You all would have been invited to the next deep dive session, which is on school balances, reserves. The terms of reference is in a link in this slide, which I can circulate after the meeting. So it'd be great if as many of you as possible can come along to that deep dive session so we can talk about some of the pressures that our schools are under, what we do to help them manage those pressures, and also look more sort of on a comparative basis of what our school balances are looking like compared to other of our London Borough neighbours. And finally, the final deep dive of this year is around the cost of capital and borrowing. So the draft terms of reference are currently being developed, and we expect a private session in March to report to the April Audit Committee. So I must apologise that you'll probably have 3 deep dive reports at the next Audit Committee, but hopefully they'll be relatively succinct. So, to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you for your team as well, because I know that's quite a lot of work to do. But yeah, we're going to have a fun-packed final Audit Committee of this municipal year. So I can see I've got Councillor Smythe would like to ask a question, and Councillor Garbett, and I can see Councillor Maxwell online as well. Okay. Yes, we've got sort of 20 minutes for this, not questions, but we've got 5 now for questions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jackie. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there. I want to focus on business rates for retail, hospitality and leisure. Because as we know, with the cost of living crisis and all the stuff that's going on worldwide, it's having a massive impact on hospitality in general. I'm the chair of licensing, so I get to hear directly from hospitality about the challenges that they're facing. I suppose the bottom line is, I know that there are business relief schemes out there. So I'd like to know how many of our hospitality operators, restaurants and bars are actually accessing those business rates relief elements that they can. Is there anything else that we can do, for example, around maybe, I don't know, it's just an idea, but you could put an enterprise zone around a block, for example. Would that do anything to help with the business rates? Because business rates is one element, as well as rents, as well as supply chains, as well as wages going up, all that kind of thing, which they are requesting a bit more help with. And I'm just wondering, I know that resources are tight.
Councillor Smythe, I'm just wondering if Jackie might want to come in, because I don't know how relevant this is to actually Jackie's position in terms of the business rate and the operational management of it. But I'll allow you to.
All right, I'll stop there. You got the idea anyway.
Yeah, so in terms of, I think one of the things that we have to remember is that the business rates scheme is a national scheme, basically. So effectively the rules are not made by Hackney. And it's, so for example, it's worth mentioning as well, the business rates we collect are only 30% do we keep. Part of it goes to central government, part of it goes to the GLA as well. So in terms of, it's a bit different from a sort of if you think about the council tax reduction scheme, people have to claim for it. So a lot of what the reliefs that local businesses get are built into their bill. So if they've got a rateable value of a certain value, for example, 151,000 for next year, then they will automatically have a frozen business rates bill. And similarly, if they're in a certain sector, there'll be a certain relief applied to them. There is a discretionary fund which is very limited, but I think I can probably pass on to you an answer to a question that Councillor Garbett raised at Council and Cabinet, actually, which covers that in more detail.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thank you, Councillor Garbett.
Thank you. Covered a lot of stuff there, Jackie. I just had a quick question on something you said on the slides, and then a couple of questions on the strategy. Just if you go back a few, you said that'll be the last time we see those three figures. I think I missed what you were referring to. I think it's that one. The slide you said this. We're doing something to these. Can you just explain what you meant by that?
Yes, so obviously you've been working hard on balancing the budget for 24-25, and we expect to be able to obviously bring a balanced budget to full council on the 28th of February. As part of that, the work to produce a budget report, we also update the medium-term financial plan. So what you would expect to see there would be the 24-25 position balanced off, because we're presenting a balanced budget for 24-25, but we'll also be extending the medium-term financial period 1 year on. But having said that as well, obviously a lot of things have changed since we developed these figures for the last medium-term financial plan. So there will be changes to 25-6 and 26-7, both in terms of additional cost pressures that have come through, but also in relation to changes to incomes assumption, and also some of the savings proposals that have been agreed. So that's why sort of after this meeting, we'll start to see a new set of figures in terms of the MTFP as it's extended out towards the right.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Chair. Without sort of breaking the embargo and blowing the news of what the figures might be, I'm afraid, as you probably expect, that there won't be a huge change in the financial position of the council going forward, and we'll still be under considerable pressure. And I regret to say that we'll, in order to keep the stable financial position that we're so keen to maintain in Hackney, that we'll have to be making further difficult decisions into the new year, just as we had to this year.
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. For those watching online, Councillor Chapman is our Cabinet Member for Finance and works very closely with Jackie and her team. Councillor Garbett, you just wanted to ask
just
another question, and then we'll bring in Councillor
I'll ask them really quickly. So on page 35 of the pack, which is the first page of the Treasury Management Strategy papers, it notes at 5.2 about the impact of the war in Ukraine and the Middle East influencing our authorities' Treasury Management Strategy, but I couldn't see any more detail on how the Middle East situation was affecting it. So I don't know if you're able to give any details of that. And then the other one was just, from my understanding, on page 42 of our thing at 6.6, it says the highest forecast over the next 3 years. So we'll be able to meet that standard for the next 3 years. Is it just because the rest of the time is uncertain that you can only give assurance for 3 years?
So in terms of the first point, is more around the overall impact that's had on the economy, and so it's probably could have been slightly better explained, Councillor Garbett, actually, but was that in terms of the 3 years, that is the sorry, I'm just trying to find the table.
Is it the operational boundary?
Yeah, that's so the Prudential Code, which we follow in relation to capital, it requires us to set those boundaries for a 3 year period. So it's not that we won't be able to meet it, is that's the period for which we're required to set it.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Councillor Maxwell, who's been patiently waiting online. Welcome, Councillor Maxwell. You can ask a question.
Thank you. Yes, and thank all the officers for the very comprehensive report we've been sent. Just got two questions. On the first bit, the Treasury Management Update, and in the first appendix, point 6, the counterparty update, and it talks about Birmingham Section 114 notice. and that we've been advised not to undertake new lending, which obviously makes sense. I was just wondering a couple of points regarding that. Have we actually lost any money because have we got a pre-existing loan? Have we made us pre-existing loans to Birmingham or any other councils in that position? And the decision to not make any more loans once that notice happened, but is there any way that we can sort of predict if a council is one that could be going in that direction, so we don't want to make the loan and lose money on it? So I think that's my question about the risks around that. And then on the second agenda item of the strategy, point 6.1 talks about the PFI, that I think, if I remember rightly, is something that goes back many years. And if I understand right, it costs us quite a lot of money to maintain that PFI, but we've not been allowed to buy ourselves out of it. So I just wondered if there's any update. It's one of our buildings, but I'm sorry, I can't remember. I do remember hearing it talked about before, and that we've previously tried to buy ourselves out of that because of the very large cost it is. So if there's any sort of update or anything we can do about that. Thank you very much.
So in relation to the section 114 and Birmingham, no, we didn't lose any money on it. We do get warnings from our Treasury advisors in relation to who we can and cannot borrow or lend to. It is worth mentioning, though, that although we wouldn't obviously lend to Birmingham, etc. now, it is very unlikely that money would be significantly at risk because it's a government organisation. So we would potentially get the money back, but it's obviously we haven't got any money with them at the moment. So we did, for example, have some money with Thurrock, but that was paid back in full. There wasn't an issue. So it's something we keep on top of, we monitor, and we take advice on, but we haven't got any money at risk with Birmingham. In terms of
insured in some way by the government, then?
Yes, because when we did have money with Thurrock, I hope it's Thurrock. It was Thurrock. I'm sure it was. We actually get a letter through from government which guaranteed the money, so it wasn't in terms of what was happening there. We didn't lose.
Yeah.
So in terms of your question about the PFI building is the TLC, the Learning Trust building. Where you've got it's the central, the library, and what used to be the Learning Trust. Yes, you're absolutely right. Your memory is right. We did try to buy ourselves out of that, and it was unfortunately the government put in place steps which meant it wouldn't have been efficient for us. So that included the fact that we get a grant for PFI. And they would have suspended that grant, so effectively it wouldn't have stacked up financially, and it still wouldn't have to stack up financially.
Right. So, okay. Just one final question. In terms of us taking out loans from other councils and other places, are we likely to be doing more of that as we're facing more, having to make more cuts and efficiency?
No, because we take out borrowing for capital purposes. The most efficient way of borrowing is usually via the PWLB. What tends to happen when you hear about these issues with other local authorities, it's where other local authorities, we've invested in other local authorities rather than the other way around. We do tend to go to the PLWB because we get the best rates there.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jackie. Thanks very much, members. So I just wanted to cap that we're Audit Committee is recommended to note the Treasury measure and activity reports and approve the drafts Treasury Monetary Strategy submission to Council, and then subject to capital programme that's been finalised ahead of the budget report with delegation to Group Director of Finance to approve the final Treasury Management Strategy for submission to Council. We note that, and but yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much. We now move on to, we're back sort of on track now. We now want to move on to agenda item 7, which is the Climate, Home and Economy Directorate Risk Register. This report is going to be introduced by the Group Director for Climate, Homes and Economy, Ricardo. Hi, sorry, Ricardo. You need to write. No, I know. So thank you, Ricardo. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Have you got colleagues online as well contributing? Is it just yourself? It's
just myself.
Thank
and
you.
I may turn to Deirdre from time to time. depending on what questions I get. Thank you. So in terms of a broad overview, as per the introduction and background, we have continued within Climate Homes and Economy to retain oversight via the Directorate leadership team of all of the key risks, cross-cutting risks affecting the Directorate's work. And you'll see in the report, there are some specifics that we have pulled out to highlight as major and ongoing risks. But also, there is one new risk which I'll come to later on. Broadly speaking, the overarching risks that I presented when I appeared before the committee back in April are still very much there. So key risks such as the impact of the cost of living crisis on our residents and stakeholders and businesses that we support. Again, that's a risk I'm sure you'll see across all Directorate risk registers and at a corporate level, but that very much is still a prevalent one. Damp and mold, again, a key risk that cuts across a lot of the Directorate's work, but impacts on the private sector, private rented sector in particular as well as those social homes owned and managed by housing associations and other housing providers. Another risk I'd like to pull out, and this links to a broader challenge that we have actually, is in relation to building safety. Regulation around building safety is still very much evolving. For example, taking the housing service, we effectively have two regulators that we have to report to. We have the regulator of social housing that looks at our standards and how we engage with customers and residents, and ensuring that we're not putting them at detriment or at risk. But then there's also the HSE, which has been established and given new powers to oversee actual safety of buildings in terms of Grenfell. We're still waiting, in light of Grenfell, we're still waiting for a lot of secondary and further regulations to come through over the coming period, but that is an ongoing risk for us. The other one I'd like to highlight, so I can leave, or two more, so I can leave as much time for questions as possible, is in relation to the housing service and council property repairs, as it's termed here. So Jackie alluded to it in one of her slides earlier on about the pressures on housing and the additional funding or overspend, as it were, in relation to reactive repairs, which is an ongoing trend that we've seen. And we tried to sort of recast the budget in order to account for that additional demand. But there's a long history and context going back to us having to deal with a backlog caused by the pandemic, which you've addressed now. But just trying to ensure that we've put proper measures in place to deal with the challenges and demand as we go forward. So in terms of mitigations, we've put in new measures around going out and undertaking surveys and inspections within 5 days. And we tried to address leaks within 24 hours or by the end of the following day. It's reported to us and treating it as an emergency. But that is an ongoing challenge for us. The last risk, which is a new one added to my Directorate risk register that I'd like to flag, is in relation to the Housing Ombudsman. So before Christmas, back in November, we were issued with a letter from the Housing Ombudsman instigating what they call a paragraph 49 investigation into our handling of complaints, repairs, general repairs in regards to the housing service. Now, we have had a few initial conversations with the Housing Ombudsman about the timing and structure of that. But the reason it's on the risk register is, as with many other social and local authority landlords, it's starting to become a recurring theme in how we cope with the demand and the pressures on the service. But it's absolutely right, given the potential sort of reputational risk, and we don't know what the findings are gonna be from the report that they produce after their investigation. But as I said, it's really important for how we work with them and how we serve our residents going forward. So that's a new risk I just want to flag. I'll stop there for any questions.
Thanks very much, Ricardo. And thank you so much. I think it just goes to show, doesn't it, that the fact that you have put the housing ombudsman up there as a new risk as well, and are able to articulate what the council's doing in response to that as well. So I'll open up Councillor Garbutt.
So keen to ask some questions. Thanks, Ricardo. I know you've got a really intense, a massive portfolio, and you're dealing with a number of kind of external pressures. I do have a few quick questions. First one is on, so they're both on, first two are on page 79. First one is the Hackney Living rent opportunities. So I know this was mentioned at the last one, so I just wondered if anything had been achieved, or if you know what the next steps are with that. So the Hackney Living rent bit. The next bit's on damp and mould, which obviously is high likelihood, high impact currently. But I'm just wondering what your marker will be to bring it down in terms of risk. Like, what would, what's the good look like to start seeing it move down? At what point will that likelihood kind of come down from your perspective? I wondered if the retrofit target should be on the risk register, because didn't we hear at Living in Hackney that the retrofit target was going to be missed? So I just wondered if that should be on the, or is it a lower down risk and it's on the risk register somewhere else? I did have another question, but I'll wait and see if we've got more time.
Shall I? Yeah. So sorry, just to clarify. So your first question related to Hackney Living rent.
Yeah. So just it says
okay.
Hackney Living rent opportunities are constantly sought. So I just at the last, I know that was a similar update to when you bought the risk register last time. So I was really interested in it. So I just wondered if any had been sought, and then when and how it, like when is the next opportunity, or is it just a constant thing?
Yeah, so it's something that we keep on the review, but it's worth just being clear that the projects that are within our program, so our new homes delivery program, have been cast to deliver genuinely affordable housing, so social rent and shared ownership, with an element of private sale to cross-subsidise that. Now, the Hackney Living rent model, it has to be scheme specific. There are huge viability challenges. It's a very difficult product to fund. So whilst we previously procured via an opportunity that came to the council a proportion of Hackney Living rent units. Yes, if the opportunities arise, we'll continue to explore them, but that sort of falls outside the approach that we're taking generally in regards to our new build program. There are also some specific, planning challenges as well in terms of bringing forward that product, because it doesn't attract grant. And so your next question was around damp and mould and what good looks like. Very, very good question. So I think how I'd respond to that is, and not got the time to go through it here, but in terms of how we've, the measures that we've put in place and how we've ensured oversight and management of it, there are some, KPIs that we keep a track of in terms of, the number of visits that the team does to address these issues, whether they're unique visits or not. We've also put in place additional resource, dedicated team, sort of focus on, addressing the issues, having a first time fix when we go in so we don't have to keep going back. But I think the overall state and, quality and age of our estate, means it's going to be very, very challenging, for me to say, once we get past the number of units or a number of homes, being upgraded or improved, the issue will be eradicated altogether. I don't think that's the case. We're talking with stock in a lot of cases, in some cases that, are 100 years old, when they weren't designed for showers with a whole load of steam to be inside. There's issues of overcrowding, which link to broader challenges. So it's hopefully I've answered your question somewhat, but I don't think it's one I can definitively say when we get to this point, the issue will have been dealt with.
Last quick one was the retrofit target that we heard at Living in Hackney
Yeah.
that was being missed. Is that maybe it's just not at the higher level and it's on your risk register lower down maybe?
Yeah, so that's one I'll take away and review. What I would say, so we've made commitments as a council, having declared a climate emergency around retrofit and wanting to retrofit our stock. But I would say that there is a risk there, but we just don't have the funding. You know, it comes back to money. You know, we're a major landlord. 30,000 homes, 10,000 leaseholders, which brings its own challenges, 20,000 tenants. The cost of retrofitting our entire stock is really, really difficult due to cost. We have been successful in securing funding from government via the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which we're trying to work through and get off. But I think it's a really difficult one. But I take your point, and you know, we'll take that away and consider it.
I'm just mindful. I'm just going to take one more quick question from Calby at Smurf, and then we'll note the report.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo, for that. Mine's around street cleansing, and it's related to waste, and therefore it's related to your brief. It's also related to the economy. I was looking for it in the risk register. I might be looking in the wrong place in this particular one. It might be on the general one. But I mean, I've expressed these views before. I think, you know, street cleansing in the borough is vital. It's really important that we keep doing it. I know there's pressures for resources on street cleansing. If I can't find it on the risk register, why isn't it not there? Why do I want it on there? Well, it impacts the quality of life for residents if our streets are filthy.
What's the question, Gilbert?
The question is, why isn't it on the risk register? Why can't I not find it on the risk register? Because I think it should be, because it's a resource question, which is under
waste management bit.
Pardon?
Which particular bit? Because it might. Which particular bit around waste management?
It involves waste, the management of waste on the streets, so it's relevant.
So is that in terms of? Sorry, can I? Yes, just to clarify, is that in terms of the cost of running the service, or is it?
Yes, it's to do with the resource implications around street cleansing, which affects the waste service and affects the quality of life for our residents in the borough.
Yeah. So I think while it's not explicitly pulled out, you know, the waste services as a specific risk. I think what you'll see in the corporate risk register, and certainly in the most directorate ones, is we talk about the cost of living crisis, but there's also a cost of doing business crisis. Just as, you know, businesses are affected by costs and, you know, inflation and everything else. Those costs, there are a lot of unavoidable costs, you know, that we have to incur. And with a service like, you know, the waste service with, you know, lots of vehicles and equipment and so on, you know, the cost of fuel, for example, impacts on our ability to do the service, to deliver the service. You saw in Jackie's presentation earlier, environmental services, which waste services falls under, is one of those services that is overspending this year. So I take your point, but I think there's a broader issue, and you know, it is a well-run service, you know, against any of our comparators in London, and there are increasing pressures. But I wouldn't necessarily say at this point that there is a specific risk to highlight and pull out here, as you suggested. Again, more than happy to reflect on that.
Maybe you could follow that up outside. I was just going to say on page 86, Councillor Smythe, there is something around restricting residual waste, which I think is related to expected rise in residual waste disposal costs. So I think, is that what you were probably indicating? So there is something there. So I suspect what probably is worthwhile mentioning is that my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the risks registers connect to ongoing sort of policy implementations that we're doing as a council.
Yeah.
So we do absolutely right under the, I should know this, I work in public health. Public health, we do obviously have a statutory duty to collect the bins and collect the rubbish, but in terms of the detail, I would suggest the restricting residual waste, which does talk about recycling and all the other things that we obviously want to encourage within the borough as well. That might be something that could do it, but I would suggest maybe having waste as just a big entirety as a risk. because we are, I don't know if you can carry
Sorry,
on.
Chair, I'll
Because
take
we
it
are
outside the
collecting
meeting.
the bins, like we're not collecting the bins.
So we do have that risk on there, but maybe I misinterpreted what you were saying, but the collection of residual waste is separate to, how we clean the streets.
I understand all that, but the risk to me for not having clean streets is a risk to business, it's a risk to the economy here, it's a risk to residents, so that's why I want it on the risk register. If we can't keep our streets clean, which is the fundamental first principle of local government, in my opinion, then we're in trouble. I'm just making a point.
Sorry, we'll take that away. I'm not.
Right, Councillor
It's
Gardner.
it's not about bins, but I know we're short on time, but I'd just like to, and Ricardo, we can probably have a really good chat about this outside the meeting, but I'm obviously really excited about the mention of the citizens jury, which you probably knew I'd be excited to see. And I am interested in if that jury's got decision-making and budget-making powers, obviously relevant to audit. So I know that's probably a longer conversation, but it'd be good to have a chat about it outside.
Okay, thank you, members. So in regard to, and also to Ricardo as well, for that. So the Audit Committee is recommended to note the contents of the report and the attached risk registers and the controls in place. No, thank you, members. Thank you very much, Ricardo. And then we'll move on to agenda item 9, which is the corporate risk register, which unfortunately for Ricardo, some of his portfolio, his are also quite high up on the corporate risk register, but we've managed to get that detail tonight. But thank you very much, Ricardo. You're welcome to stay. And I'll hand over. Is this who's presenting this? Matt. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Chair. Good evening, everyone. This is the first full review of the corporate register since last June, although obviously headline scorecards do continue to be presented each quarter. So a few standout features from this latest version. The cost of living crisis and challenging economy continue to dominate the register, with two distinct risks relating to these, both at the maximum score. One risk focuses more on the impacts the crisis is having on the organisation, the community, and local businesses and even staff. The other risk is more focused on the economic side internally, with the increasing budget gap, as detailed by Jackie just now, that we're facing. Within the register, the workforce risk has changed significantly, reflecting some of the internal challenges over the last year, particularly internal changes in leadership. There are two new risks on this iteration of the register. The first relates to adult social care budgets, which are not sufficient to meet current demands, therefore creating serious challenges going forward. The second proposed new risk relates to failures within the new education case management system called Synergy. And this was proposed for escalation to this register by Hackney Education's senior leadership team, reflecting their serious concerns about the situation with this. One previous risk relating to the potential of a major power outage has now been taken off this corporate register, but remains under review at directorate level. That's not to say this is no longer a risk, but controls are thought to be sufficient to manage it. The other new risk from June 2023 from the latest review of the register related to children's residential placements, and this does remain on this corporate register. The climate change target score remains red, reflecting the continuing long-term pressures relating to these targets. And I know this is something that remains of great interest to members. Also, for your information, we just thought it was worth mentioning there are a few glitches in some of the reporting lines reflected within this register as a result of some of the recent leadership changes. So if there are any questions that can't be directly covered, obviously we can take them away.
Thank you very much, Matt. We are again just being recommended to note this, but I will take any if anyone members wanted to ask anything specific regarding the corporate risk register. I think take that as a no. So thank you very.
A quick one on page 203 of ours. It says something about a certificate running out next month. And I didn't know if that was an issue. As in the IT bit, it says that a PSN compliance certificate valid to February. I didn't know if that was something to be concerned about, and if that, I know that the update is from November, so maybe someone's done something about it.
Yeah, I remember this review from the conversation with Rob Miller, and I'll get clarity on that, because obviously we're going to have a review at the next meeting, and indeed a full version in June. And yeah, I mean, my assumption is obviously that does need to be extended and will be extended, but we'll get some clarity on the exact PSN status.
Thanks. And I've got some other bits and pieces, but I can email them. Thanks.
Ms. Smythe, thank you.
I'll try and make it directly relevant to this meeting. And apologies for that, that explosion about street waste. Okay, cyber attack. It says here there's a risk for externally hosted services. How can you reassure us or assure us that, how are you going to control them as they're externally hosted, is my point. Have you got an eye on them? Is there a process that we can kind of look at in order to make sure that they don't get us into trouble? On the page 5 of the risk register, I think it's 203 on my online version. It says there are direct risks to the systems used by the council services, including those which are externally hosted, and also risks relating to data that the council is responsible for, which is processed by third parties. So it's the third parties and the external people that I'm concerned about. What can we do anything about that? Can we make sure that they're not going to get us into trouble?
I think the general answer would be that when we enter into contracts with external suppliers, there would always be clauses there that address things such as data protection, ICT controls. So that's kind of standard within the agreements that we enter into. It's obviously not a guarantee that something can't go wrong, but there are standards that major suppliers, or well, indeed any supplier that's interacting with government would be expected to meet, and they would have accreditation as well. But in general, I think that would be the assurance.
Thanks very much. If there's no more questions on item 9, corporate risk register, can I just ask members to note the contents of the report as attached? Thank you. And then we're going to have agenda item 10, which is the audit and anti-fraud progress report to January 2024. And this is going to be introduced by Michael Sheffield. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. The internal audit plan is progressing well in the year to date. We have got 90% of the plan in progress, which compares to 67% at the equivalent time last year, although the number of completed audits is broadly in line with last year at 26%. That's broadly what I'd expect at this time of year. There is a push at the end, work's underway, and so more follows through at this time of year. That's also against a backdrop of a larger plan that's in play at this year, which is 62 audits compared to 52 at this time last year. Of the audits that have completed, no negative assurance results have come from those, so that's no limited and no assurance audits. You will notice within this report that we've enhanced the reporting in terms of the deferred audits. And the background to that is that in recent years, due to exceptional circumstances, more audits have been deferred than is usually the case. Now, although that situation is receding, so as of this report, there are 6 deferred audits, which compares to 11 at the equivalent time last year. And at the end of last year, we had 22 deferred audits, which is quite a few from the plan that we approve. So we've put extra measures in place because I'm conscious that when we report back to you, that we're not, if we're not able to look at something, we're not necessarily picking, well, we're obviously not picking up if there's something untoward, and the fact that we can't look may be an issue in itself. So where the deferral request of itself raises issues, they are now being reported to you. And you will see that one deferral request has been assessed without audit work taking place as no assurance, and that relates to leaseholder debt recovery for major works. The main issue in this area is that some information is not available following the cyber attack, and that's preventing some billing for works to leaseholders. Debt recovery was paused following the cyber attack, and some actions which have been identified to improve the situation need to be followed up. So that is why that audit is showing with the status that it is. There have been further improvements in the implementation of recommendations more generally. So at the time of the last report, we had the Hackney medium recommendations at 75% implemented. I'm pleased to say that just in the space of 3 months, that has risen to 95% completion. So obviously that's partly to do with the chasing and the work by the audit team to get that information in. It's also obviously down to the audit clients who take the audit recommendations seriously and make sure that they are followed up. And in terms of the school's recommendations, where implementation has also always been much lower, nevertheless, that's increased from 70% 3 months ago to 84% implementation today, which is also a significant improvement. The external review of internal audit has been finalised, and the service has been categorised as generally conforming with the professional standards that we are expected to meet. And generally conforming doesn't sound like a glowing endorsement, but it is at the higher end of the classification and comparable to most other London Borough internal audit teams. I'd note that none of them are assessed as fully conforming, and some of them are assessed lower at partially conforming. That report will be circulated to you all following this meeting. And the reason that it hasn't gone out to you ahead of the meeting is that there is one recommendation from the review that relates to the audit committee itself rather than internal audit as a service. And we will be bringing some more information to you about this at the next committee meeting. That's the intention once we've followed the due process. So you should be seeing more on this at the next meeting. But that recommendation is that SIPFA issue guidance about best standards, and in relation to audit committees, they say that there should be 2 independent members on the committee. That guidance is not legislated, so it's not a mandatory requirement, but government have indicated that they intend to move in the direction of making it mandatory. And that, allied to the fact that many of our peers across London already have these arrangements in place, means it's something that I think we do need to properly consider. In terms of what is an independent person, it's a non-councillor who is suitably qualified with experience in the area of audit, financial management or governance, and they bring specialist knowledge and insight to the workings and deliberation of the committee, but they do not have voting rights. And so that's kind of like the gist of that in a nutshell. And like I say, the intention is to bring you more detail on that to a future committee, hopefully next committee meeting. So that's the update on the internal audit side. In terms of the investigations work, the covering report sets out that the estimated benefits from all of the investigations during the last 3 months is in excess of £900,000. Referrals to the team are up 20% compared to the January 23 position, and that's driven by higher volumes of referrals for parking and no recourse to public funds. You'll notice that there's significant higher volumes of processed NFI matches, National Fraud Initiative matches, and that's because council systems had recovered significantly from the cyber attack, which presented a lot of Hackney data going into the previous National Fraud Initiative matching round. And there continue to be positive investigation outcomes across the range of services and the range of areas that we look at. And that's the areas that I'd highlight. I'm happy to take any questions.
Just before I go to questions, I just wanted to, Chair's discussion, I just wanted to make a point to congratulate that actually since April to December, nearly £1 million has been recovered potentially in terms of the investigations, in terms of tenancy fraud, no recourse to public funds and blue badge parking. And when you look that there's over, nearly £800,000, £800,000, for tenancy. Sorry, my numbers, I'm black with my numbers. I think it shows that we're able to then, I suspect, Michael, we can then take those tenancies back and then release those properties back to those that need them. So that just wanted to point that. And then also, I know that we're going to have the external peer review report in more detail at the next meeting, but just to assure members that the recommendations is something that has to go through our own internal sort of approval thing in terms of going, because it will be a constitutional change essentially. So that's why but it's just, obviously we'll have a little bit more detail from Michael and his team. But yeah, open to questions. Councillor Gerber, Councillor Smythe, sorry. Gosh, I'm not with it today, sorry.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. Top work as usual. Just talking about prosecutions, I'm looking at the table on page 260. In 2022-23, there were 3 prosecutions, and in 23-24, there were 8. The questions are: is that about standard kind of thing? We're usually looking at about kind of between 3 and 8 every year. How expensive are prosecutions? Are they expensive for us to bring prosecutions? In other words, do we try and avoid them because they're so expensive? So it's just a general question around prosecutions, around the price of prosecutions, around the level.
So a little bit of background. All of the prosecutions across both years are in relation to parking offences. And if you see the volume of parking referrals that come through, you'll see that 8 is a small percentage of that. So if we're looking at prosecution, there's 2 things we have to look at. We have to look is the evidence there, and is there a public interest in going forward with it? Because as you rightly say, it's not a cheap exercise. Hackney's got limited resources, and I think to a degree it's not even so much the cost, it's how many lawyers have we got and what do they need to be concentrating on to give maximum benefit to the council. So it's not a decision that's taken lightly, and in terms of where we do prosecute, we would particularly be more inclined to go that way if someone has been misusing a permit and it has been stolen or reported lost from someone, or it's a forged document. I'd always draw a distinction between that type of offending and someone borrowing mum's badge when they shouldn't be using it, which I absolutely don't endorse, but it's a different category to consider. So we take quite a lot into consideration, and there are some real restrictions on taking everything down a legal route, and I don't think it's right to take everything down that route anyway.
Thanks, Councillor Gub.
Thank you. Really interesting report. I'm glad you clarified the cyber attack being the system availability on that postponed review, because I was going to ask about that, because I think it sounds like they weren't participating. So I'm glad you clarified that was a cyber attack. I was going to ask a question about on page 246, the fact that the KPI around 90% of audits being completed by the end of the year, and we're currently on 31%. I'm assuming that's because of where we are in the year, but if you anticipate reaching that 90%. And then another one on, I think you said in the intro that we didn't have any limited outcomes, but I thought there was one around housing. On page 252, there's a limited outcome in the kind of housing in Cranston TMO, and I didn't know if you had any information about that, because it's had like 3 high priorities and then the audit assurance was limited. So I didn't know if you could provide some information about that. Thank you.
Okay, so taking first of all the KPI of the 90% of the audit plan as completed to final or draft report stage by the end of the year, yes, I believe we are on course for that. You know, challenge me on that next meeting, but we are. 26% 3/4 of the year way through the year doesn't sound like you're going to get there, but I'd emphasise first of all, there's always work that's carried over from the end of the previous year. So the first part of our year is getting to 100% from the previous year. So we don't necessarily start working on the current year's plan on the 1st of April. And the other thing is that we've got 90% of work in play at the moment. So quite often the battle is getting it into play. Once it is in play, then we can be confident that it will move forward. Moving on to the limited outcomes, I should have been clearer that there have been no limited outcomes in this reporting period, which I mean since the last meeting. So I think there was a school and was it TMO since the start of the year, but they happened earlier, would have been reported to an earlier committee.
Thank you. I've got one more question, and we've got a quick
question.
Yes.
On page 259, the number of matches seems to be massive compared to other columns, like especially for housing tenancy and council tax, like huge differences. So I just wondered if you could, like 2,000 up to 25,000 and 600 up to almost 3,000. And I just wondered if you could explain that massive jump.
Sure. The National Fraud Initiative takes council data, matches it to other council data and other public sector data. And the matches that we get back are not always a reliable indicator that there's anything amiss. It depends on things such as the quality of data. Is there any fundamental issue in terms of what's being matched to what? And we will also get a lot of data that is matched year on year. It will have been looked at previously and been given a clean bill of health. So and the other thing is when that data comes back to us, it's been risk scored by the National Fraud Initiative. So we don't necessarily look at every single thing that comes back. We don't have the resources to look at 38,000 matches. So we have to prioritise. We have to go on how they're rating the matches themselves. Some of that work will be fielded out to other council teams and they will take a look. Some of it will be done on a sample basis. So the numbers are large and we have to take those approaches to get through it, and we don't ever expect to get through all of it. The numbers that have been cleared from the current match, first of all, in the 2020-21 NFI matching, the data upload took place in October 2020, which was the same month as our cyber attack. So there was a lot of data that was out of scope and couldn't be matched. So you'll see that in some of those columns it says NA for the number of matches in previous years. And then we've also had a restructure on the team, taking a slightly different way to approach the way that we review the matches when they do come back. So you'll probably find that some of those have been sent out to teams, some have been done on more of a sample approach. And just with different people in different places, you can have a more coordinated approach to how the data is reviewed.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. Again, sterling work, particularly in the anti-fraud work. So, committee, we just asked to consider a note. Can I have indication that you're considering a note in this? Thank you. Okay, and then we're just going to move on to the Audit Committee work programme, and then to note the proposed work programme. So that's the blue piece of paper on page 263. I just wanted to, on that, just reminded me is that just for members, I'm sure you all noticed as well that we didn't have the performance review report this month at this committee, and that was due to the changes in the reporting and the time frame. Was that correct? I'm trying to remember when we had the pre-meet. Michael, did you want to just come in? I just wanted to make members aware.
Sure. So the three components of that report, you've reviewed the corporate risk register.
Yeah.
So that was a duplication. The financial aspect was covered by Jackie's update, and the KPIs for council services hadn't refreshed since the time of the last meeting.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. April is obviously our normal business, but just to note, we'll be looking at the risk registers for children and education, also for adults, health and integration, which I guess will give us a little bit more detail to those high level corporate risks that we've talked about this evening. But we've also got we've got the annual report as well, and we've got the deep dive into the public interest reports, school budgets and financial and the capital deep dive as well. It's going to be a big meeting. So has anyone got any comments on that at this stage?
Just a really quick question. The school budgets, does that cover is it primary, secondary, presumably not children's centres, but is it all school?
Yeah, so we hold the schools' balances on our balance sheet, and it's in relation to those schools, so it's primary and secondary maintained schools, obviously not academies, etc. Chair, sorry, what I've got, if it would help with the next audit committee, what I could try to do is do a slide on each of the deep dives in the finance presentation to try and help a bit manage time.
That would sound very sensible. Yeah. Thank you very much, Jackie. Yeah. Okay, members. Oh my gosh, we've come to the end. Wow, I'm on fire. Oh, yeah, we've got really quickly. So I don't. Oh, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Councillor Patrick. Thank you. Just wanted to say I haven't had any urgent business. Do we have any urgent business, Mark, that you've seen? So there isn't been any notifications of anything. So I'm just going to call the meeting to a close now. Our next confirmed meeting, as we've just talked about, will be on Wednesday, the 17th of April at 6:30. Just wanted to thank you as always to our office for their attendance and their excellent detailed reports. Also thank you to members in the chamber. Thank you to Mark, who's supported from a governance team, and also for our colleagues online and councillors, and also to our external auditors as well. So thanks very much, everybody, and I'll close this meeting. I'll do this at 5 minutes past 8. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.